The star had a name only archivists remembered. On modern charts it was reduced to a string of numbers, tagged with a gray annotation, low priority. No habitable worlds. No rare elements worth a fleet's attention. A wide asteroid belt, yes, but unstable, collision-prone, and expensive to tame. The kind of system surveyors marked once and never revisited. For 300 years, no one did. That was why the anomaly reports were so easy to dismiss. They arrived scattered across unrelated departments, navigation corrections filed as routine drift, sensor recalibrations blamed on dust interference, stellar mass readings flagged and auto-smoothed by predictive software that assumed the star hadn't changed. Because stars didn't change. Not like that. The first true hint came from a courier ship running an outdated route through the sector. Its navigator filed a complaint about timing discrepancies, jumps arriving milliseconds early, then late, then early again. Harmless, technically, but consistent. As if local gravity wells were busy. The report was archived. A year later, a deep space telescope registered a faint, periodic dimming in the star's output. Not enough to trigger alarms. Not enough to suggest a natural cycle either. The algorithm tagged it as instrumentation noise and moved on. Then an unmanned probe went missing. It didn't explode. It didn't transmit a distress call. It simply failed to report after passing the system's outer heliopause. The loss was logged, insurance paid out, and the route marked for recalibration. No investigation followed. Why would it? The system had nothing worth stealing. The galaxy had learned long ago that danger announced itself loudly, through wars, declarations, fleet movements. Quiet places were safe places. Empty places were boring. Humans disagreed. They had learned something different. They learned that the safest places were the ones everyone else forgot. The first humans arrived not in a fleet, but in pieces. A research habitat disguised as a prospecting station. A slow generation ship whose registry expired before it reached orbit. Automated factories hidden in the shadow of the outer gas giant, built to look like debris fields until they began building more of themselves. Nothing illegal. Nothing aggressive. Everything filed. That was the trick. Humans did not hide by breaking rules. They hid by following them so precisely that no one looked twice. The early years were difficult. Radiation spikes. Asteroid impacts. Long supply delays. But humans were good at endurance. They built deep, redundant systems. They planned for failure as a default state, not an exception. When the first habitat failed, they recycled it. When the second cracked, they sealed it and built a ring. When the third prospered, they built another, farther out, harder to detect. Generations passed. The star that had once been ignored became useful. Not for its planets, but for its consistency. Humans wrapped it in collectors, thin, dark arrays tuned to sip energy without causing obvious occlusion. They learned its rhythms. They stabilized the asteroid belt, not by forcing order, but by guiding chaos gently into predictable lanes. Traffic lanes. By the time the galaxy's software noticed the mass discrepancies again, they were no longer anomalies. They were infrastructure. The rediscovery began as a formality. A mid-level survey authority, pressured to update ancient charts, authorized a fly-through. One ship. Minimal crew. No expectation of anything interesting. The moment they entered the system, their instruments disagreed with each other. Gravitational maps refused to align. Background radiation spiked and fell in controlled waves. Navigation beacons, human-style beacons, though no one recognized them at first, responded to handshake protocols the survey ship hadn't used in decades. "Someone's been here," the navigator muttered. That was an understatement. As they moved inward, the emptiness vanished. The asteroid belt was no longer chaotic. It was managed. Rocks moved in coordinated patterns, shepherded by fields and tugs too subtle to see at first glance. Stations hid in plain sight, masked as mineral clusters until they rotated and revealed docking apertures. Then came the rings. Not around a planet. Around the star itself. Thin, vast structures glinting only when the light struck them just right. They weren't a full shell, nothing so obvious. They were segmented, layered, distributed. Elegant. Who builds this without telling anyone? The survey captain whispered. The answer arrived before the question finished echoing. A transmission. Civilian band. Clear. Calm. Welcome. You have entered a settled system. Please adjust course to avoid active transit lanes. No threats. No warnings. No demand to leave. Just information. The survey crew exchanged looks. Settled? Someone asked. By who? The reply was immediate, almost cheerful. By us. This is a human colony. Shock did not come from the words. It came from what followed. Population data. Infrastructure summaries. Orbital maps updated in real time. This wasn't an outpost. It wasn't a hidden base. It was a civilization, spread across every viable orbit, every stable moon, every engineered habitat the system could support. The humans hadn't taken the system in a conquest. They had grown into it, quietly, patiently, lawfully. And by the time the galaxy finally looked back at the forgotten star, there was nothing left to claim. Because ownership had never been declared. It had simply become undeniable. The survey ship did not flee. That alone would later be cited as the moment history veered away from catastrophe. Protocol demanded withdrawal when encountering an unregistered population center of unknown scale. The captain knew that. Every officer on the bridge knew that. Fingers hovered over controls, waiting for the order. But the system around them was so organized. Traffic lanes were clearly marked. Power flows were stable and predictable. The transmission they'd received was polite, almost welcoming. There were no targeting locks, no military hails, no sudden appearance of patrol craft demanding compliance. Just information. The captain took a breath. Acknowledge, she said. Civilian comms only. The reply came instantly. Acknowledged. Survey vessel Carather's Eye, registry confirmed. We've adjusted local traffic to accommodate your drift variance. Please advise if you require guidance. The bridge crew stared. They rerouted traffic, the navigator said slowly. For us. Sensors confirmed it. Massive energy flows, stellar collectors, orbital factories, habitat clusters, had subtly shifted operational timing to create a safe corridor for the single alien ship now drifting among them. No one did that for outsiders. Unless they were very confident. Ask how long they've been here, the captain said. The answer came back, precise and unembellished. Initial settlement began 312 standard years ago. A murmur rippled across the bridge. That was impossible. 3 centuries ago, the system had been classified as marginal and left alone. No follow-up surveys. No colonization bids. No expansion rights issued. And no one noticed, the science officer whispered. The captain swallowed. Ask about legal status. This time, the reply took a few seconds longer, not hesitation, but cross-checking. All expansion accords were followed. The system was unclaimed at the time of settlement. Continuous habitation and development records are available. Would you like them transmitted? The captain didn't answer right away. Because the implications were already landing. Unclaimed meant open. Open meant fair game. And humans, infuriatingly, were meticulous about paperwork. Accept, she said finally. Data flooded in. Not summaries. Not propaganda. Raw logs. Construction permits filed with long-defunct offices. Expansion notices sent to registries that no longer existed. Automated compliance acknowledgements returned by systems that had since been replaced. The humans had done everything right. They had just done it where no one was looking. As the survey ship moved deeper into the system, the scale became impossible to ignore. Habitat clusters hung around gas giants like necklaces of light. Moons were honeycombed with cities beneath kilometers of shielding. Entire asteroid families moved in choreographed arcs, mined, processed, and returned to stable orbits with clockwork precision. This wasn't frontier living. This was maturity. How many? The navigator asked. The answer came without drama. Current population, approximately 48 billion. Projected growth stable. Resource surplus positive. 48 billion. In a system the galaxy had written off as worthless. No wonder the mass readings were off. No wonder the star's output fluctuated. No wonder ships arrived early or late. The humans hadn't hidden. They had optimized. What about defense? The tactical officer asked quietly. The captain hesitated, then transmitted the question. The reply was, careful. This is a civilian system. Defensive infrastructure exists only to ensure safety and continuity. The words were bland. Reassuring. But the sensors told a different story. Every major structure had redundancy upon redundancy. Energy flows could be rerouted instantly. Civilian traffic control doubled as system-wide coordination. The difference between logistics and defense was academic. This place could not be taken quickly. Probably not at all. A smaller, faster craft approached, clearly human, clearly non-military. It matched velocity without fanfare and transmitted a visual feed. A human face appeared on the bridge display. Not a soldier. Not an official draped in symbols of authority. Just a tired-looking woman in work clothes, hair tied back, eyes alert but not hostile. Welcome, she said. I'm Coordinator Hale. We handle external relations. You're the first survey ship we've had in, well, a while. A while? The captain echoed. Hale smiled faintly. We assumed someone would notice eventually. There was no arrogance in her voice. No triumph. Just fact. You understand, the captain said carefully, that the discovery of a population of this size, this level of development, will cause concern. Hale nodded. Of course. That's why we kept everything compliant. We didn't want surprises. The captain almost laughed. This was the biggest surprise the galaxy had seen in centuries. And the system? She asked. Your intentions? Hale glanced off-screen, likely at data the survey crew couldn't see. Our intention, she said, is to keep living here. Peacefully. Productively. A pause. And to remind the galaxy of something it tends to forget. The captain waited. Space is big, Hale continued. Bigger than any one power can watch. If you only guard the bright stars, you shouldn't be shocked when someone builds a home in the dark. The transmission ended politely. The escort peeled away. The survey ship was left drifting in the middle of a civilization that had never asked permission, only followed the rules. Back in galactic space, the report would cause outrage, panic, and endless debate. But on that bridge, in that moment, one truth settled over the crew like gravity. The humans hadn't taken an entire solar system. They had accepted one the galaxy had abandoned. And now the galaxy had to decide whether it would acknowledge what had been built. Or try, foolishly, to take it back. The report detonated across the galaxy. Not because of its tone, survey officers were trained to be neutral, but because of its contents. 48 billion humans. A fully integrated system economy. Stellar-scale infrastructure built quietly, legally, and patiently in a place everyone else had ignored. Emergency sessions were convened within hours. Councils that hadn't met in decades suddenly found themselves filled to capacity. Representatives spoke over one another, voices sharp with disbelief and something uncomfortably close to embarrassment. This is impossible, one delegate insisted. A population of that size cannot exist without detection. It can, an analyst replied coldly, projecting the data. If you assume no one is looking. That was the wound. The humans had not surged into the system. They hadn't arrived with fleets or declarations. They had come slowly, generation ships, automated factories, deep time planning. Every decade added a little more mass, a little more heat, a little more order. Each change, by itself, was negligible. Together, they were a takeover no one noticed until it was complete. Investigative committees dug deeper, hoping, needing, to find something illegal. A missed filing. A falsified registry. A treaty violation buried somewhere in the centuries of data. They found none. Humans, it turned out, were obsessive about compliance when it mattered. They had filed expansion notices to offices that no longer existed, received automated acknowledgments from systems that would later be decommissioned, and archived everything. Their records were immaculate. The real revelation came from infrastructure analysis. The colony had not focused on planets. That was the galaxy's mistake, thinking in terms of worlds. Humans thought in terms of orbits. They had built habitats wherever physics allowed stability, Lagrange points, Trojan clusters, hollowed asteroids spun to artificial gravity. Gas giants became anchor points for megastructures. Moons were stripped, reshaped, and rebuilt with lead cities beneath radiation shields thicker than planetary crusts. Nothing was centralized. Nothing could be taken with a single strike. Power generation alone stunned the analysts. The star was wrapped in segmented collectors, thin, adaptive arrays that drew energy without significantly dimming output. Enough to run a small empire, distributed so widely that no single failure mattered. And then there was logistics. Traffic control wasn't just about ships. It was about mass flow, materials, energy, people, managed by systems that could reroute entire economies in minutes. What looked like civilian infrastructure doubled as strategic depth. Every habitat could isolate. Every factory could relocate. Every transit lane could vanish. One analyst summarized it bluntly. This system is not defended. It is unassailable. Military planners were brought in next. They hated what they saw. There was no obvious capital to seize. No throne world. No central command node. Even the human administrative centers were spread out, redundant, and buried deep inside civilian megastructures. An invasion model was run. Then run again. Then quietly shut down. Even conservative estimates showed losses so extreme they bordered on the absurd. Not because humans were aggressive, but because the system itself resisted intrusion. Every approach vector was monitored. Every environment was controlled. Every attempt to force entry triggered cascading complications. "You don't conquer this," one admiral said. "You suffocate trying." The most disturbing conclusion, however, came from a civilian economist. "They didn't take the system," she said. "They replaced it." What she meant became clear as trade data surfaced. The colony was not isolated. It was connected, quietly exporting refined materials, energy credits, specialized manufacturing outputs through intermediaries. Its products had been flowing into the galactic economy for decades, disguised by layers of subcontracting and neutral brokers. Entire markets depended on human output from a system no one knew existed. Pulling back now wouldn't hurt the humans. It would hurt everyone else. That realization shifted the conversation. Anger gave way to calculation. Calculation gave way to resignation. The humans hadn't challenged galactic authority. They had bypassed it. A delegation was assembled, not to demand withdrawal, but to understand boundaries. Carefully worded messages were sent to Earth and to the colony itself. The response came from the colony, not Earth. Coordinator Hale appeared again, same calm expression, same work-worn clothes. "You want to know how we did it," she said. "It's simple." She brought up an image, the original system chart, marked low priority. "You didn't want this place," she continued. "So we made it worth wanting. Slowly. Quietly. Without bothering anyone." A delegate bristled. "You've destabilized regional balance." Hale shook her head. "No. We stabilized ourselves. You just noticed late." Another voice cut in. "What if someone challenges your claim?" Hale paused, considering. "Then they'll have to decide what they are really fighting," she said. "Us, or the fact that we're already here." The transmission ended on that note. No threats. No ultimatums. Just reality. The galaxy had always believed territory was claimed by force. Humans had demonstrated another method. They had taken an entire solar system the way forests reclaim abandoned cities, root by root, year by year, until one day the concrete cracked and everyone suddenly realized the land was no longer theirs. And now the question was no longer how the humans had done it. It was whether anyone was foolish enough to try to undo it. The Galactic Council convened in emergency session for the first time in 87 years. Not because of a war. Not because of a disaster. But because an entire solar system had been lost, without a single shot fired. The chamber was filled beyond capacity. Representatives who had not spoken to one another in decades now argued across shared tables, voices overlapping in frustration and disbelief. Legal advisors projected clauses and precedents into the air, highlighting passages that suddenly mattered again. Expansion accords. Settlement timelines. Continuous habitation statutes. All of them pointed to the same uncomfortable conclusion. The humans were right. The system was classified as unclaimed, one legal delegate said, mandibles clicking with irritation. That designation was never rescinded. Because no one thought it mattered, another snapped. We assumed marginal systems would remain marginal. That assumption, the legal delegate replied coldly, is not a law. That was the problem. Galactic law had always been written with conflict in mind, borders contested, worlds seized, resources fought over. It was designed to resolve disputes. There had been no dispute here. Humans had not arrived with fleets. They had not evicted anyone. They had not violated protected space or displaced an existing population. They had simply stayed. For centuries. A motion was raised to retroactively reclassify the system as protected heritage space, invalidating the human claim. It failed within minutes. Retroactive law was a dangerous precedent. Everyone in the chamber knew it. If the council could rewrite history here, it could do so anywhere. No empire wanted to hand that power to its rivals. Another motion followed, to impose population caps, infrastructure limits, or partial governance oversight. That failed too. The humans had exceeded every proposed limit generations ago. Enforcing compliance would require intervention on a scale indistinguishable from war. And war, the analysts agreed, would not go well. Military briefings were delivered next, behind sealed doors. They were worse. The system was not just populous, it was entrenched. Civilian habitats doubled as hardened structures. Industrial zones were distributed so widely that no strike could cripple production. Energy reserves were sufficient to sustain isolation for decades. More troubling still, the colony's defensive capacity was almost entirely passive. There were no grand battle fleets stationed in orbit. No intimidating formations meant to project power. Instead, there were systems. Traffic control that could deny safe approach. Energy fields capable of reshaping engagement geometry. Logistics networks that could outlast any siege. Taking this system would require total commitment, one admiral concluded. And even then, success is theoretical. And the cost? A counselor asked. The admiral didn't hesitate. Civilizational. That word ended the briefing. The council recessed in silence. Publicly, outrage spread. Media across the galaxy framed the discovery as a human betrayal. Accusations of deception, manipulation, and exploitation flooded public discourse. How could an entire civilization hide in plain sight? How could the council have been so blind? Privately, something else spread. Fear. Because once the anger burned off, a quieter realization took hold. If humans had done this once, they could have done it again. Emergency audits were launched across galactic charts. Marginal systems were re-evaluated. Worthless stars suddenly received attention they had been denied for centuries. Too late. Many showed signs of early development, resource extraction, infrastructure scaffolding, subtle traffic patterns. Not always human, but often inspired by the same idea. That you did not need permission to exist. You only needed time. The council drafted a new law within days. The active oversight mandate. Any unclaimed system would now require periodic review. Automated neglect would no longer be acceptable. Expansion windows would be narrowed. Monitoring increased. The law passed unanimously. It was celebrated as decisive action. The humans did not object. In fact, Earth's representatives, when finally asked for comment, offered only a mild acknowledgement. It's a reasonable change, the human envoy said calmly. We might have benefited from it ourselves, once. That line unsettled more people than any threat could have. Because it implied something no one wanted to say aloud. The law wasn't meant to stop humans. It was meant to stop anyone else from doing what humans already had. By the time the Council formally recognized the system as a sovereign human-held territory, after weeks of debate, revisions, and carefully worded compromises, the reality on the ground had not changed at all. Life went on. Ships moved through managed lanes. Factories continued their cycles. Children were born under artificial skies, never knowing their home had once been considered irrelevant. The law had arrived. But it had arrived too late. Because law, like territory, only mattered before someone settled it. And the galaxy had finally learned the difference between ownership declared and ownership lived. Once the law was passed and the outrage cooled, the galaxy faced a quieter, harder question. Could the system be taken back? Not legally. That debate was over. But practically, military planners were asked for options. They were given time, resources, and access to the colony's published data, because the humans had hidden nothing once discovered. The answers came back slowly. And none of them were encouraging. The first proposal involved overwhelming force, a multi-empire coalition, total blockade, staged assaults on key orbital nodes. The simulations ran for days. They all failed. Not dramatically. Not with heroic last stands or apocalyptic explosions. They failed through attrition. Every strike disrupted trade elsewhere. Every ship committed to the effort weakened borders at home. Every month of engagement increased economic damage across half the galaxy. The system did not break. It adapted. Because the colony had never been designed as a prize. It had been designed as a place to live. Civilian infrastructure absorbed stress the way ecosystems did, redirecting flows, compensating for losses, closing wounds before they became fatal. There was no moment of decisive victory to aim for. One strategist put it plainly. You don't conquer something that isn't trying to win. The second proposal was isolation. Sanctions. Trade embargoes. Diplomatic pressure. That failed even faster. The colony was a net exporter of refined materials, energy credits, and specialized manufacturing components. Cutting it off would hurt the humans, yes, but it would cripple multiple economies that had unknowingly come to rely on its output. Worse, the humans had diversified deliberately. No single market depended on them entirely, but many depended on them enough. Pull one thread, and half the fabric unraveled. The final proposal was subtle intervention. Encouraging internal division. Supporting splinter movements. Exploiting cultural fractures. That, too, went nowhere. The colony's population was vast, but its identity was stable. Generations had grown up knowing the system as home, not as a frontier or an asset. There was no ruling elite to overthrow, no central authority to decapitate. The humans didn't govern the system like an empire. They inhabited it like a biome. In the end, the councils did nothing. And in doing nothing, they made their choice. The system was not reclaimed. It was accepted. Over time, outrage faded into curiosity, then into precedent. Other species began to study the colony, not as a threat, but as a model. What if growth mattered more than conquest? What if patience beat projection? What if the quiet work of living outweighed declarations of ownership? Humans, for their part, did not gloat. They did not expand aggressively outward. They did not leverage their position for dominance. Trade remained fair. Access remained open, within reason. They had not built the system to prove a point. They had built it to endure. Years later, a junior counselor asked the question that had once seemed unthinkable. Why didn't they defend it more openly? Why not deter us outright? The answer came from an old archivist who had been there when the first reports arrived. Because they never needed to, she said. By the time we noticed, the system wasn't something you could take. It was something you'd have to destroy. The room fell silent. No one wanted to be responsible for that. And so the hidden colony remained, no longer hidden, but still quietly astonishing. A solar system that had been ignored, dismissed, forgotten. Now thriving. Now human. Final HFY line. The galaxy thought power was taken by force. Humans showed them it could be grown.